So, without further ado, we have our next speaker, who barely needs an introduction, Fergus Garrett.
Well, what a wonderful conference this has been. Can I just so thank you to all the speakers, and especially thank you to the team at Beth Chatto's for putting this together. And can I, before I start the talk, I was going to ask all the Dixter team to stand up. Well, why don't you all stand up? Everybody who's associated with Dixter, all the students, volunteers, everybody, because this stuff. Because all of this wouldn't happen without you. Okay, I'm here talking about it, but it wouldn't happen without you. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the biodiversity audit at Great Dixter. Some of you will know the garden, some of you won't be familiar with it. It's a big historic house with 6 acres of garden around it. It's known for colour, you know, the sort of swashbuckling colour combinations of cannas, dahlias, you know, all those sort of colourful things that its owner and gardener, the wonderful Christopher Lloyd, loved. But it's also known for allowing the countryside to come into it. So this is not a strange scene at Dixter, what you see behind me of clipped topiary with ornamental plants, but with a sea of white cow parsley that engulfs that space. So it's a very dynamic space and very colourful, and it's gardened, you know, so it's artificial, it's gardened by us. And it's got many advantages. It's got an extraordinary design, compartmentalized into a series of rooms. It's got that kiss of history and time on it. So you've got wonderful worn paths, and you've got lichens that are making patterns on top of the stone. You've got plants that have overgrown their space, but we leave them because we like that sort of tactile experience, so that you have to sort of brush past them. So everything is softened by vegetation. So it's got this sort of very atmospheric, very charming look about it. But that doesn't mean it's going to be biodiverse. You can be naturalistic as you want in your planting. You spray the living daylights out of your garden, you're not going to have any insects there. So we garden it with a soft touch, which is really quite important. So the seats are like this. You know, this is a seat in the sunk garden where you've got vincas and centuria and campanulas and geranium macarizum, those sort of things, along with buttercups and dandelions and cow parsley, all of those things sort of kissing your neck as you sit there. And the place is really very dynamic. You know, so if you look at this dry stone wall with Euphorbia robiae, with Aubrietia, Primula vulgaris, and those sort of things that are at home within it. Within a few weeks, that same wall does that. You know, with the oxeye daisies that come up through it. And then, you know, that's the same wall a few weeks later with giant fennels, with double gorse and libertias and all of that. So it's native and exotic mixed in together. And I love that juxtaposition of, you know, the countryside just beyond, those linear hedges, topiary pieces, those stock beds, those nursery stock beds where we split our nursery plants from. And amongst all of that, you've got the wild flowers that run through all the planting, the rivers of them that come in through to the space. And some years it looks like this, and in other years it looks like that. So we play with the amount of wilderness that we have within it. And of course, Dixter is well known for its meadows as well. You know, those bits of grassland that are allowed to flower. And they're extremely rich. You know, they're full of orchids and adder's tongue ferns and all sorts of things like that. But also they're full of non-native plants as well. You know, of varieties of crocuses and so on, that camassias and those sort of things that are part of that grassy network. Behind the garden, beyond the garden fence, you go into a much more native land. But it's rich, you know, with orchids. Very interesting, isn't it, that picture of orchids there? And if you compared it to another bit of grassland that gets trampled, that hasn't got many orchids on it and many sort of delicious species and so on, and sheep go on it as and when they escape or we want to put them somewhere, and we have the plant fur on it, that field has got 3 times as much biodiversity than this field full of orchids. Interesting. So this is what the talk's going to be about. This stuff is just full of surprises. So this is the topiary lawn, a formal lawn that Christopher allowed to grow. We planted 3 things in it. Dianthus carthusionorum we planted. We planted harebells in it, and we also planted fox and cubs in it as well. All 3 things died, but the orchids came, and there they are, just absolutely just full and getting richer and richer as we go through. And you see, that's the context of the garden. And this isn't everybody's cup of tea, this garden, because a lot of visitors, especially years gone by, used to come into Dixter and used to absolutely hate the fact that it had long grass amongst its ornamental plantings, used to hate the fact that it had self-sowers coming out of the cracks and so on. And thank goodness there's been a shift in all of that, as I said in the panel talk. So our walls look like this. Not at the moment they do, because they're all brown, but with red and white valerian, with Mexican daisies, with rusty back ferns, and those sort of things that spill out from the walls. The walk up to the terrace is full of Centuria, Centranthus rubra and Erigeron carvinskianus and those sort of things. And then you go up those really charming steps, and you go to the terrace itself, and it's like this. Again, not to everybody's taste. I've taken people up there, and I'm sure they would have reached for the weed killer when they got there. But this is the sort of the environment that Christo liked. He liked to sit here, put a table out, and liked to be amongst all those flowers that changed from one season to another, and liked to see all of those bees and butterflies and all those things come and visit those flowers. So he felt that he was part of that community. And, within a few weeks, that community changes to that as the oxeye daisies go, and the diorama pulcherrimums flower, and the campanula lactifloras flower, and so on. And here is a nursery stock bed, the edge of a nursery stock bed. And this is where we have our mother plants to feed the nursery. And you can see, that sort of that kiss of the wild there with its oxeye daisies and various other things, with self-sown poppies and those things. So it's quite interesting what happens in that garden, because that space there that you see with all these things that are self-sown, within a few weeks go to that space. It's exactly the same area. So there's layer after layer after layer of vegetation. But that sort of that touch of the wild that we have, that allowing that sort of countryside to come in, to embrace the garden, is very, very apparent at Dixter. It happens with the meadows that come into it, but then it's with the self-sowers that run through all the beds and engulf it as well. So you'll see a section like this, which will then go to a section like that, which will then go on to flower in late summer and autumn as well. Very informal, but jam-packed full of plants. So one of the things that's important for us, by the way, if any of you are wondering why on earth isn't he talking about insects, that was a mistake. That's probably my fault. I wasn't going to talk about insects. I was talking about the biodiversity audit at Dixter. So, but there will be insects in there. So this area underneath, a forest of Prunus tenella. You've got Galanthus SR, not Crocus thomasinianus, that flower first. Then the Prunus tenella flowers next. And after the Prunus tenella flowers, you can see the leaves of Centuria montana underneath, and the Centuria montana takes over. That sort of planting has been there for years and years and years. We cut the prunus back, as you would do if it grew on its own. We could cut these cornflowers back to stop them self-sowing. We would do that if it grew on its own. But you see, Dixter is jam-packed with these multi-layered communities of all sorts of plants, some native, quite a lot exotic, that just take up that space. So it's not all about dahlias and cannas and those sort of things. It's about this sort of planting as well that determines that space. It's about snowdrops that are then taken over by the foliage of bluebells, and then the bluebells flower after that, and when the bluebells finish, the Persicaria virginiana, the Begonia grandis evansiana, and all those sort of things then come up through, and that space is then taken up by that. You know, very little maintenance, but jam-packed layers that mimic what goes on in the wild. And that's important, because that actually long season is a part of why we are so biodiverse. And the same with the borders. And I thought, I'm not going to show picture after picture after picture of the long border, because you'd probably get bored of it, really. But, you know, a border like that, that's sort of early summer. Later on, this is taken this year, changes. You know, it just changes, and flowers come and go. Some are annuals, some are perennials, some are climbers, some are shrubs, some are trees. You know, some are volunteers that we don't want. Some are, they put themselves in the right place. But it just changes. It's very, very, very dynamic, and it's full of color and very rough. And that changing element is just exactly what happens in our meadows. You know, you go from the crocuses to say, you know, I'm simplifying this, but you go from the crocuses to say something like snake's head fritillaries, and then they give way to the orchids, which then give way to Centuria nigra, to the various grasses, Agrostis tenuis, to Vicia cracker, and those sort of things, the Lotus corniculatus, all those meadow plants that come and give us a late flush. So what happens in our bluebell woods, where you've got a succession of vegetation, of wild plants that come and swallow each other up before the canopy closes in? And what happens in our meadows as you've got the succession of plants that come, one overtakes another, happens exactly in the garden as well, to give that place a really long season. And then, of course, we play. We play around with pots to make pot displays like this, which then flower and do this, and then once they finish, we get other pot displays, because we're gardening that space. And you saw the amount of people that stood up. I'd much rather have that place full of people rather than just thinking low maintenance, low maintenance, low maintenance. You know, I think because if you listen to, I mean, John didn't expand on it, but I mean, what a terrific talk John Little gave, isn't it? It makes it possible to do this stuff. It makes it possible to do this stuff in towns and cities and urban areas by having somebody who just has got the ability to sort of take all of that, and of course he's been doing it for years, and apply it to those settings. But you know, we always talk about low maintenance. We always talk about that. That's the Achilles heel of everything that we do, actually. As John's been an advocate of that, has been as Richard Scott. Let's put pressure on the greater sort of bodies out there to actually release money to look after these places and do that, to make sure that we create these communities that work in the greenfield, rather than just all the time struggling. You know, the money goes to capital projects, but not to the people who are going to look after it, as John has been talking about for years and years and years. But see, that's the solar garden taken this year, you know, one evening. And if you went to Dixter now, that same space looks like that. Only been watered 4 times this year since January, that space. But that's another thing. But you see how dynamic this is. And so you would, sort of any ecologist coming into this may think, this is so artificial, it's so sort of man-made, what's going on? So we garden it hard, although with a sort of soft hand, but it is gardened. And it's an adventurous garden. It has these sort of things that are in its corners, you know, colour, annuals, biennials, perennials, all mixed in together to give us this sort of joyousness that place gives us. We're all within the meadows that weave through that place, all within those wonderful walls and steps that are dripping with vegetation, all within those cracks that have got dioramas and those things coming out of it. So it's got variety. That's the other thing that's really quite important. You know, it's got an exotic garden that you lose yourself in with all these sort of things that are, you know, conifers and tetrapanax and aralias and eucalyptus and trevesias or trevesias and all of those things that are part of that scene, a jungle, you know. And from the jungle you step out through a shed and you know, this is the jungle. You see, I took those leaves off the exotic garden last year. I was going to give a lecture on all the plants that we use in there, but you can see the variety of plants that we've got in here. So we're propagating these, you know, we're taking cuttings, or we're lifting and dividing and storing them and then planting them out. We're just playing with this. So there's a real sense of fun in that place. And some years it may look like this, and in other years, it may look like that as we're playing with it, depending on what we've propagated, what we're using. So that's that. So again, you know, highly artificial, playful. So you think, well, biodiversity levels in a place like this must be low. Okay? You step out from the shed, from the exotic garden, and you walk into a place like this, smoke bushes with coming up through a meadow of oxeye daisies and so on. Again, a lovely sunset. But you see sort of that strange juxtaposition that you've got between that sort of thing and this sort of thing happening all the time at Dixter. So Great Dixter is a sensitively but highly managed flower garden open to the public. We're colourful, dynamic, dramatic, and full of non-native plants, and gardened. And gardens like us, large or small, are sometimes labelled as unnatural, and all things bad associated with old-fashioned gardening. And so everyone, ecologists especially, expected the wildlife value at Great Dixter to be low compared to the countryside beyond. So that was really interesting. And then we know we're in crisis, don't we? You know, we know that's because, I mean, I haven't said where these sources come from, but you pick this stuff up from the internet or from newspapers or whatever that, you know, more than 40% of UK species are showing significant decline. Swift populations are down, cuckoo populations are down, turtle doves, woodland bird index, pollinator index, you know, all of those things, and not just us, in Europe as well. You know, I think Dave Goulson talked about Germany, 79% of decrease in insect population. Okay, so we're in crisis, and we're always saying thousands of acres lost to development, thousands of acres lost to intensive agriculture. The land is fragmented, and the biodiversity is isolated. And even we in the green industry are sometimes out of touch with the natural world that's around us. I certainly was. You know, and look at the colleges. You know, you still have training courses that have, it's all about spraying. There's a section on spraying and pesticide. Of course, it's good to know how to be careful with this stuff, but actually not enough done on biodiversity or sustainability and all of those things. So there has to be a shift in all of this. So dear old Christo, who gardened that place, who lived there and gardened it and put the magic into it, he died in 2006 after setting up the Great Dixter Charitable Trust. And we guessed that the estate was relatively rich. The estate is about, I would say, about 50 acres on top of the 6 acres that we've got. So we've got woodlands, we've got pasture land, we've got sort of bits of meadow land as well. So we guessed that the estate, because it'd been managed in the same way for all those years, that we guessed that it was going to be pretty rich, okay? But in the garden, historically, we sprayed for weeds and pests. Not much, but we did, you know. We tidied all corners, especially outside the garden. We sterilized our soil, and I don't mean the soil in the nursery. We used to sterilize the soil in the vegetable beds and so on. I don't know what we used in there, but it was just, you know, it would knock you out. So goodness knows what it was doing to all the sort of soil life that's there. But we were also wildish with meadows coming into the garden. We allowed self-service, etc. We enjoyed the badgers, the butterflies, the bees, the slow worms, the grass snakes, woodpeckers, great crested newts, and so on. And Christo was a naturalist. He was really quite knowledgeable, and he loved wild places rather than gardens. He loved wild places more. So we were sensitive, but not proactive in any way. So these are the sort of things that we would see at Dixter. And we'd sort of pat ourselves on the back to say, oh, we've got loads of great crested newts, and oh, look, lots of badgers, and, you know, interesting spider, and all of this. And so we thought we're going in the right direction. So it was just very, very interesting. But by the time Christo died, I wanted to take things further. You know, so we stopped spraying, and we started using organic fertilizer instead of inorganic, and we used less of it because there's no need to sort of put it on just for the sake of putting it on. We're just sort of very vigilant about how we were planting things. So we just cut all of that stuff out. We stopped using peat as well. After we just sort of phased that out a long time ago. And then we allowed the outside edges to grow in that garden, because I thought, well, actually, what's the point of mowing these areas? You know, we're mowing them to get tidy, so let's just allow those things to encroach in. So this is, you know, what was that, 15, 16 years ago, and that raised quite a few eyebrows, and also from our own staff it raised eyebrows as well. They were saying, oh, what's happening to the car parks? It's looking a bit messy, whereas I thought they were looking charming, you see. And so, but you know, so one person's charm was another person's mess. But there was a lot of our team was saying, great, you know, how's you know, and this is looking really wonderful, because the place started to look like that, with cow parsley billowing out and so on, and we'd have these sort of desire lines as we beat down the grass, and place really brilliantly charming. But my wife, who's a zoologist, who I love dearly, and kept on nagging me, because she sort of worked in conservation projects, and she's a scientist more than anything, so she understands the way to go with this. And she kept on saying, why don't you get a proper audit done? You know, and Christo was very close to her. You know, very, very close to her, and they talked about insects all the time. And she said, why don't you get an audit done? Because then you've got baseline data, because you're starting to change things, but also you know, importantly, what you've got, so that you can act accordingly. So I sort of, I ignored her, unfortunately, and just carried on. I introduced cow parsley into the garden, because Christo wouldn't have it in the garden. I introduced it, and even dear old Beth phoned me up to say, Fergus, I've heard from Lady Mary Keane that you're introducing cow parsley. Aren't you worried about what it's going to do? And I said, Beth, I'm going to try and manage it. But you know, for me, I said to myself, you know, if this was a rare Chilean umbel, we'd all be paying £15 in a nursery for it. It's got those sort of qualities. It's a wild plant. So why are we sort of doing this? It's just had this sort of wonderful diaphanous effect that, you know, and it's sort of movement and running through. So I'm going to use it. So I started doing this sort of thing, and Dixter became even more charming as a result. And then we started playing around. We started creating more meadows and in the fields outside of the garden. And as Dave said, so much of this habitat has been lost. 97 or 98% of the species-rich ancient meadow has been lost since the 1940s. I know meadows have been created as well, so you know, people can argue about that sort of percentage. So I thought, well, create another meadow, you know, introduce a few honeybees as our pollinators, enhance the pollinators we have at Dixter, and job done. You know, we can pat ourselves on the back. And of course, we did this without knowing that honeybees are bad for pollinated diversity. You know, and they are aggressive, non-native, disruptive plant pollinator networks, as well as being very inefficient pollinators, as it was mentioned, as the way they collect pollen can destroy the viability of pollen, so that mining bees and leaf cutters sort of lose out. And mining bees and leaf cutters are so much more efficient, as John said, rightly pointed out. So, you know, before I went to university to study horticulture, ecology was part of that course. The only pollinator we talked about was the honeybee. We didn't talk about much else in that course. Of course, that was ages ago. So, I was ignorant in all of this. So I thought, well, we'll introduce a few honeybees, and that'll be it. So those are, the badgers love them, actually. But so I had to put the fence around them, and so I thought, job done. We got more pollinators. And then we started creating these meadows, and they involved the village, and these are my two daughters, Aisha and Nili, who were hay strewing from our main field, and suddenly that new field that we had down at the bottom went from 90% grasses to having all of these wildflowers in it. So again, we would pat ourselves on the back. And Amanda would say, what are you doing? Get a proper audit done. Then you know what and you can manage it accordingly. Again, so I ignored her, and we sort of got into bed with Butterfly Conservation, who looked at our woodlands and did surveys. And then we started cutting the woods a bit more to make hurdles and these benches and try and make, failingly try and make our own charcoal, and had sort of making posts and fences and so on. So we cut the wood a bit more so that we had this sort of mosaic structure. And I'm not going to go into this. This is a different lecture altogether about this sort of very interesting management scheme that we came up with sort of scalloped edges, areas that were cut regularly, areas that were cut, high forest that we left, natural vegetation, regeneration that we allowed in there, selecting out seedlings and so on and so on. So we had this sort of really lovely sort of mosaic system in our woods that had this sort of light and warmth going to cold, dark ground. Okay, job done, pat on the back, but no, not good enough. And if the success in our woodlands was down to creating a mosaic habitat and diversity of structures, why not do the same in grassland, I thought, but this was all sort of very ad hoc, wasn't it? So, and at this point, we had no idea. And I'd been a great fan of Terry Wells's, which Richard Scott mentioned. So I knew that there were these sort of different cutting regimes, and so it wasn't just a case of cutting a meadow at a certain time. You could be flexible within it, and that would create different habitats. So we started grazing at different densities, cutting at different intervals beyond the garden, leaving some areas uncut, and so on. And then I bought a moth trap and thought, great, we can look at our moths. And suddenly we started seeing this sort of invisible life, this secret life that went on in the garden that we weren't aware of. We were aware of butterflies. We were always watching the peacocks or the red admirals and the orange tips and so on, and saying, great, aren't they here? But I had no idea about moths. And suddenly you'd get, in one setting, you'd get 25 to 30 elephant hawk moths in there, and just great, extraordinary diversity of these sort of most amazing things. And so a whole new world started to open up in front of our eyes. And Amanda still said, get a proper audit done. It was, so it's not just about those sort of pretty little things. There's much to be done. And so, here's Amanda and the sort of top left, and Sarah, who was helping me in the office then, and they, as Jackie was, they were all worked at for the Zoological Society of London. They're all brilliant minds on this. So we started to we set up this sort of biodiversity committee and started getting sort of Edward Mayers in to look at our swifts, and Nicky Gammons to play around with our bumblebees, and so on, and started doing all this stuff. But again, it was slightly ad hoc. So I wrote to the British Ornithological Society and said, would you like to come and survey the garden? Because I think it'll be quite interesting. And they wrote back to say, we try not to go to gardens because we find them relatively sterile environments. But there are nature reserves near you that we'll probably visit. And some of our members may want to come into the garden at some point. So I was a bit put out by this. So I wrote back to them and I said, well, why don't you have your annual general meeting here, and we'll give you booze, food, anything you want. You don't have to survey the garden. So they came, and they were all sort of dressed in tweeds and so on and so on. And our lead ecologist that did the survey, Andy Phillips, was the registrar for the British Ornithological Society. And he tells me when the letter came through and they read it out, he was one of the people that voted that they don't visit Great Dixter. Because he said, garden, I've been dragged around 2 gardens. They're usually quite disappointing, whereas there are plenty of nature reserves around us. Okay, so they came. They had their meeting, they went out to the compost heap. When they went out to the compost heap with their little pewters after their meeting just to get a bit of fresh air, I think they found 77 species within half an hour on the compost heap. And they went out then past the sort of down the kitchen drive to a little gate there. They found, no, it was the front gate. They found a spider that had only been, that's only found in 3 other places in the UK, living under this little metal bit here. You can't see it because the screen's quite bleached there, actually. Should really bust those lights on those. And then they walked down this path, and there was a York stone paving covering a watering point, and they found a spider in there that had been last recorded in Sussex in 1920 or something like that. So by the time they came round to me, I didn't know any of this. They were sort of foaming at the mouth, saying, "Can we come back?" And so I said, "Yes, of course you can come back." And then before I knew it, the British Arachnological Society newsletter came through the door. And in there, so this is March 2013, Dixter was on the front page with so I think there were 7 or 8 pages with all the lists of spiders that they'd seen on that visit. So I thought, oh, we've cracked it, you know. And then so they came back, and I mentioned this in the sort of when we were having that sort of forum discussion. They went to my wood pile, which sits in the plant fair field, and they found these little burrows that can you see? Yes, you can see in there, and they found a really interesting beetle in there. And they said to me, "Do you mind if you don't use that wood pile?" And I thought, where is my firewood for the winter going to come? And so because we found that beetle, and we really like to study that habitat. So I thought, all right, I'm going to leave it. And I always fancied myself to look like this and create haystacks. So then I decided to create these habitat piles. So I then decided to have a no-burn policy at Dixter. So that must have been about 2013, 14, something like that. And then we started making these wonderful habitat piles. We didn't know what we were doing. We started being creative with it. So we were just playing around, get an idea, get some information, play around with it. That's what gardeners do. They're creative. And it was quite interesting. And at that point, I was sinking, dead stems into the ground as well, drilling holes in it, and allowing the grass grow underneath it. And I said to my wife, "Well, we're gonna pick up roadkill, and we're gonna put it on top of the posts so the buzzards come down." And she kept on going, "No." She said, "All you're gonna get is blowflies." And I said, "Well, then something will come and get the blowflies." And then I'd see a woodpecker and the swallows would be back, and then I'd go home and she'd say, "Get a proper audit done," because I haven't done it, So it just went on like this. And she said, "Get a proper audit done, because it's a sort of like this sort of web of life, there is this web of life. So you need to understand what goes on so you can act accordingly." So I went to the Heritage Lottery Fund and asked for a grant. And they were brilliant in that they gave us the grant to get a proper, full-blown audit done. And we got sort of 20 oil specialists. Because the other thing Amanda said to me is that if you're going to stand up and talk about how that Dixter is rich for biodiversity in front of a group of ecologists, you need the facts. You need the proof there. And you don't need that facts and those proofs from you as a gardener saying, "Well, I saw a red admiral." You need the actual somebody to do a proper survey so you can then actually say, "This is what we've got, this is the way we're going to go, this is how we're going to change things." So we did an archaeological assessment as well. And we looked at the vegetation, we looked at lichens, looked at butterflies, moths, the whole lot. And so we had extraordinary characters like Peter Davey came, who was he was interested in lichens on seats and so on stone, but he's also interested in the roof. And so I saw somebody getting a big ladder out from him. He could hardly walk, and he was trying to scale the roof at Dixter. So it was just a wonderful range of people like this, And this was the result. And it's more than this, Dan. But there was over 2,300 species recorded in 1 year from a handful of visits. There were over 100 species of lichen. There were 130 species of bee out of a total of 270 species in the UK. And there were several of principal importance. There were nationally endangered species, nationally rare and scarce species. Used to be 15, but now there's 16 species of bumblebee out of 2024. There are over 400 species of moth, 32 species of butterfly out of 59 total, and over 220 species of spider out of a total of 650. And that was from a handful of visits. So obviously, numbers will go up as we survey more. Rare species were easily found, which means that they were common within our site. And our lead ecologist, Andy Phillips, who didn't want to come to Dixter in the first place, said Great Dixter was one of the richest sites he's surveyed in his 30 years of surveying. And it has changed the way he thinks about gardens. Yeah. Now, he now calls us a garden nature reserve and thinks we should be designated a local nature reserve or a local wildlife site. But this is, perhaps surprising and unexpected within the ecological community. It was. Now, I'm not saying every ecologist, but certainly within the people that I'd met. Because there can be a prejudice against a traditional garden like ours. That can happen in the horticultural community as well. And I want to just say this, there's nothing new about this. People have been talking about the Great Dixter Biodiversity Audit and so on. But Jennifer Owen, and of course this was mentioned yesterday, Jennifer Owen did this all those years ago. And, Dave said that perhaps her garden was one of the sort of richest sites in the UK if you look at the area it covers. He may have even said the world. I'm not sure about that, but it's about in terms of sort of metre square. But I don't know. I mean, the thing is, here's a small garden. It's an ornamental garden. As Ken Thompson put it, it wasn't fake countryside. 2,673 species in 750 metre square, and so extraordinary work. So, and she hasn't got the credit for that. And she was way ahead of her time. And, Dixter's doing this, but there's all these people who've been doing this for years. Richard Scott's there. He's one of my great heroes, Rich, because he's not only done this over the years, for many, many years, but he's brought communities together. Great sort of meeting of people, and amazing things come out of that. And you listen to John Little's talk as well, what sort of powerhouse he is in this. And he's been doing this for years, and so he's inspired the stuff we do at Dixter. Chris Baines has been doing it, Nigel done it, Dr. Miriam Rothschild, Dan has been so connected to the space around them and countryside coming in. And of course, Christo did it as well. And not just in this country, but there's all sort of Margaret Roach in the USA has been writing. She's a columnist for the New York Times. She's been writing about this stuff for years and years and years. So don't think it's a new thing with Dixter. It certainly isn't. We've been doing it for a number of years, and Christo was very on it. But we didn't really clock on to sort of doing this sort of stuff until after Christo died. And that was driven by Amanda, but it's also driven by people like Richard as well. And it's driven by me meeting people like John in this sort of part of this journey. So why is Dixter rich? Dixter is rich because there's a wide range of habitats: wet, dry, sunny, shady, mosaic woodland to mosaic grassland to bare ground. It's detritus rich. There are porous buildings. It's an old building, but you can see from what John said, those buildings, that same effect can be done in a modern construction unit as well. And when you talked about porous buildings, people go, the weather's going to come in. You don't mean that. You mean making little nooks and crannies. The building is stable, but making little nooks and crannies for all these things to find a little sort of hole or somewhere to sort of put themselves. Like Amanda said, things need somewhere they need things to eat, they need somewhere to sleep, and they need somewhere to breed. As simple as that. So it's porous buildings. There are fence posts that are old and got holes in them. There's recycled materials, especially wood that's old. There are porous walls. There are dry stone walls, but the lime mortar has crumbled as well. It's a complex and diverse mosaic of habitats. It's that diversity that's important. There's also, as I showed you, there's a long season of pollen and nectar-rich resources. There's layered planting over a long season. Some areas have 7 layers of vegetation, and it's not just natives. Exotics and natives rub shoulders so that you get this sort of great long season. So long season of food is important. There's no spraying for the last 14, 15 years or however long it's been. So care, that light touch, important. Trauma and disturbance, whether it's a pig or whether it's a JCB or whether it's, a mini digger or whether it's a cow. Robins used to follow the pigs and wild boar around. They follow us around the garden. It's the same thing. We're making holes for them. So trauma and disturbance from digging. It creates another habitat. Bedding plays a part too. There's a diversity of practices. The types of flowers are important. High populations of umbels and alliums, which allow a wide variety of pollinators to land on them. We grow a lot of species, but nothing is chosen because it's good for pollinators, and nothing has been chosen because it's good for pollinators. Okay, so variety is important. The web feeds itself. The more there is, the more there will be. So that's the other thing. And creativity, what Dr. Nigel Dunnett calls creative ecology. We work outside the norm, we're inquisitive and we experiment, we do these things that are that are interesting. That's why you don't want to be over-prescriptive, and Rich was saying that, because that sort of element of chaos, as everybody does their own garden in a slightly way, but in a gentle way, without the spraying, that will create that very, very diverse mosaic. And of course, there's history, there's years of activity in that site, which is important. So activity is a good thing. Just standing back is not necessarily a good thing. So an intensively managed garden with ecological practices can be a haven for wildlife, and Great Dixter proves this. Just want to make sure I don't run out of time. What time is it now? Okay, I've got 10 minutes. Yeah, we'll run out of time. But small gardens can add up to be significant, and so can urban spaces. Each of your little spaces can add up to something really significant. And not all of you have to have a meadow, because actually you don't want just meadows everywhere, because that's just too much of the same thing. You want short grass and bald areas and long grass areas that are left for longer scrub. You want that diversity, And urban spaces, rooftops, parks, pavements, cracks, walls, and all the stuff that John's doing. Every space can play a part in this, and wildlife will and can adapt. And we don't need to rewild to do this. And it's great that rewilding is going on. It really is great. And it's all the other work that's going on is great. But gardens can play a part too. We can blur the edges between horticulture and ecology whilst creating beautiful artistic spaces. And at the same time, we can start embracing some of our wild plants and see them in another light. And that's what I've done as well. It started with a dandelion that had this rare mining bee on, so that I stopped weeding out all the dandelions. Then it went on to buttercups. It was the cow parsley and so on. These are beautiful things, and they can play a part in the garden scheme. Not everything has to be exotic, so it's just rubbing shoulders of the wild and the native. And, gardens are woodland edge. And in the UK, we've lost much of our integrated system of woodland merging into grassland, the two coexisting. Even, that's a valuable ecotone. And Dan talked about this the other day when we were on a conference call. And that ecotone is a really rich part where one meets another. And it's a rich zone, and this has been tidied up and lost, especially around the countryside around us. And we've managed grasslands as grassland, we manage woodlands as woodland. So gardens serve as woodland edge. That was just really interesting to sort of think of it that way. With enhanced diversity of flora, with enhanced diversity of structures and habitats, you have something really special. It's the perfect storm, isn't it? And there's no reason why this can't be replicated in towns and cities. Towns and cities are full of extraordinary structures and woodland edge effect as well. But we need to be brave, bold, diverse, and dynamic. And the visionaries need to be given power to do this, because there's always barriers, and we have to overcome these barriers. And as well as that, gardens capture a wide audience. And this is one of the sort of interesting things about Dixter. We're highly ornamental, colourful, exciting, but also we're wild. So we're it's that nudging that audience that maybe are not the audience, the converted audience, down this road of actually embracing more wilderness, and then we'll get there. Dixter also mimics a soft cliff habitat. I talked about that earlier, a habitat which is under threat in the UK and is home to a number of invertebrates and others which thrive in a place which is constantly eroded. So bare and porous paths adjacent to vegetation which is constantly reworked. This is an extremely valuable and dynamic habitat which greatly enhances our biodiversity. Well, and we don't rework everything at Dixter, but you see what this came from Andy Phillips. You know what he's saying there. He's thinking about the habitats he's studied for years and thinking, he's trying to work out why Dixter is so rich, you know, and there are sort of obvious reasons. It's got a diversity, but actually these sort of activities of gardening is important. So, you know, this is Dixter, this sort of habitat. And if you think about it, there are 433,000 hectares of garden in the UK. There are approximately 240,000 hectares of roadside verge in the UK. There's 1.7 million hectares of urban area in the UK. And all of that is out of the food production zone. So they can all play a part. That's all within our control. So if you look at this picture, there's Dixter. And you say, well, how does that relate to the village that's around it? Well, look at the village around it. It's got green corridors coming into it. It's got conurbations or buildings. Dixter's got buildings. It's got paving. Dixter's got paving. It can have long grass areas. Dixter's got long grass areas. It can have short grass areas. Dixter's got that. So Dixter's got cracks in the building where things nest. So when we're building, we can actually, or by just attaching things to buildings, we can sort of simulate that as well. So it's really all of it is doable, and that's the same in a city as well. So Giacomo and Tom were talking about. I was really moved by that talk as well. And so it's absolutely possible to do this in highly densely populated areas. So for Dixter, just so that we understand it, we produced a biodiversity heat map just to look at it, and rightly or wrongly, because one area feeds into another. So we'd separated all the different areas that make up Dixter, and the ornamental garden, the formal garden, was the borders and the buildings, not the meadows, borders and the buildings. So then we looked at the whole area, and we thought when we were starting the survey that the woodlands or the orchid-rich grasslands or the ancient pasture land was going to be the richest. But the richest part of the whole estate was the sunk garden. Absolutely by far the richest part of the whole estate. So, and if you look at these figures, in terms of aculeates, which are bees, wasps, and ants, the formal gardens had the highest recording. If you look at Diptera formal gardens, they're the two-winged flies, highest recording. Lepidoptera, moths and butterflies, formal gardens had the highest recording. Hemiptera, which are true bugs, formal gardens had the highest recording. Odonata, which are dragonflies and damselflies, formal gardens with water had the highest recording. Parasitoid wasps, formal gardens. And out of this, at this point, 676 species found, 271 were within the formal gardens, with the next bit being the plant fair field. So all of you coming to the plant fair at Dixter, which is coming up and trampling that field, you're actually doing a lot of good in there. And then if you look at the conservation designation areas, formal gardens supported those as well. And then if you look at the number of species associated with habitat resources, nectar and pollen habitats, herbaceous vegetation habitats, stem and thatch habitats, scrub and tree habitats, bare ground habitats, dead wood post habitats were all highest in the formal gardens. So when we're creating a wildlife garden, we always think about that, don't we? Whereas that was richer in biodiversity, and the richest of all was that, the gardens. So it surprised me, this, because I would always think that was going to be the greatest, but it wasn't. But all of it works together. That's the important thing, as we've all got to work together. So look, the fact that we don't cut down our vegetation, that's important. We leave the stems up in the winter. The fact that we grow these sort of plants, that's important. Umbels and apiaceae and all of those things that are just dripping with insects. The fact that we've got the long season is important. The fact that areas of the garden have got these different structures within it. So look, snowdrops goes to that, it goes to that. That's the same area and it ends up like that. So lots, very dynamic. Plants coming and going. Nothing we're planting, they're self-sowers, shrubs, etc. All of that. gives us the variety. You've got highly colourful borders. We've got pathways that mimic the roads. You've got mown areas that mimic the mown areas in a town and city. You've got long grass. Hopefully we'll have more long grass in towns and cities, and woodland edge planting, and buildings that are porous. All of that gives us the variety in there. And look at the variety from the edge of the horse pond. One area is wet, has vegetation like this. The other area is drier. There are orchids just a few feet away from that. Then there are worn areas, there are shady areas, there are extremely shady areas, there's lots of cracks in wood, and the gardens are just round the corner from that. Just over the hedge, the gardens are like that. So you can see how a small space can actually have the diversity, because there's diversity within it. The walls are dripping with vegetation, but they're also, they're the habitat for all those things that live in them. There's no sort of strong pointing in the walls, in the paving, so things can sort of burrow them and make their homes within that. The buildings are porous. Cracks or little woodworm holes or whatever in an old building. Modern build stuff can have that. You can turn people with brains here, you can do this. And people, John's doing it with all sorts of stuff. You could create a porous modern building. Whether it's roof, the way we have our roofs. We have thatch roofs, which are excellent. We leave dead wood standing where it's safe. Look at all the sort of like the habitats that we've got within that garden. We're not overly tidy, but we still look good. There's lots of detritus within that garden, leaving all that vegetation rather than clearing it all up. That's an important aspect as well. And then we're creative, whether we're doing stressed, again, this was inspired by John, stressed roof habitats with grasses on them, or whether we're putting log piles, whether we're stopping the drainage and of certain areas and flooding those, as we've done in that little hollow. We're just playing around with things. And of course, as well as all of that, we've got this colour and beauty and long season within the garden. And of course, then, these things come. Okay? So ecologists have considered gardens and design landscapes to be a part of the problem, but they may realise that we can be a part of the solution. Okay? Gardens, large or small, in the countryside, urban or suburban, areas, whether they are public or private, along with roadside verges, urban areas, brownfield sites, and so on, together will add up to something effective, not just for biodiversity, but for climate change as well. I'm nearly finished, really am. So it's wonderful that you've got Bosco Verticalia happening. It's wonderful that NEP's happening. It's amazing what John is doing, and it's also good that we've got gardens as well. So look, it's that mimicking of that same sort of mosaic system and environment. And look at what's happened at Sheffield with Greater Green, with Zach Tudor and Dr. Nigel Dunnett. An area like that turned into an area like that. And so well-being comes into it, as well as providing a habitat and dealing with stormwater and so on. So, but it shouldn't stop there. Meadows running through towns and cities. You look at Hastings with all the poppies that are there and that sort of car park. It's amazing, isn't it? Well, the following year, that's what happened to it. They sprayed it all off. Who on earth is doing that or paying for somebody to do that? It's just we need a shift change to stop that sort of thing happening. And even though we've got all the literature and all that stuff, you're still creating places that are sort of quite inert. There's no sort of accommodation for insects or any sort of greenery in these spaces. And if I had to walk around Hastings, look at what's coming out of, edges of lotus corniculatus down at the bottom there. All these sort of things coming out of cracks and walls and so on. And gardening in cracks. I've started the garden that cracks within our town, allowing, even tarmac places that can have seed thrown on it. So you've got this vegetation. A neighbour of mine's doing that on the bottom left there, and she's got sort of this succession of self-sowers that are on top of the tarmac, old tarmac that's got very little soil in it, and all the cracks along the edges of the paving. It's not just creating beds and parks, it's doing something with these areas as well. And look at the sort of how tight that mortar is. Look at that brick wall. And just that little bit of give allows you to have that sort of thing in there. It doesn't need to be a crumbling, dangerous wall in order to make this happen. We can make it happen in new builds. And people say, oh, yeah, of course, you're Dixter, we can't do that. Of course we could do that, And again, that wonderful seat at Dixter. And this is my giant fennel on top of about 4 inches of soil, coming out the grass on a sort of down at the cafe at Dixter. It's about us being brave and experimenting and trying different things. And that creativity exists within the gardening and design community. So we pair up with ecologists. You've got something really powerful there. That's my fence at home, which has got lots of little holes in it, you know. And I was just using slab wood that was going to be chucked away at a local mill. So I gathered that up and made my fence out of that. And it's just this extraordinary insect hotel. And that's why I said earlier about getting into bed with ecologists, because we need knowledge. You know, we need knowledge to go forward. Knowledge is key so that we can act. And that knowledge said to us, take away your beehives, because you've got such a wonderful solitary bee and mining bee sort of population. These hives were actually harming them, and the ecologist said, you really must do that because you've got something really special there. So we did. We took away our beehives, you know, and so that the other things could flourish. So what makes Great Dixter Richest relevant to any design landscape or any garden? The mosaic system within Dixter can be replicated in any village, town or city. It just needs politicians, ecologists, town planners, councils, builders, landscapers, architects and landscape architects, volunteer groups, gardeners and private individuals to have the will to work together. It's about bringing wildlife in at every opportunity. Gardens and gardeners can play a part in this, and everyone will bring a different element. So let's all work together and set an example. Thank you very much. Thank you.